Hey guys, it's Adam from LUCIDPIXUL, and today I have a very special and very sentimental treat because this book was illustrated and written by two of the most influential artists in my entire life. One of these artists in particular created a book at one point that really, in my opinion, knocked over that first domino that paved my future as an artist. This artist, if you can read titles, you know where I'm alluding to. This artist had created a book that had a certain type of approach towards illustration, towards storytelling that defined me artistically. It kind of set a certain precedent for me moving forward. The two artists in this book, called FAERIES, are Brian Froud and Alan Lee. Now, Brian Froud, if you're not familiar with him, just think of the movie Labyrinth. Think of the movie Dark Crystal. If you're familiar with those films, you're very familiar with the creature designs, the goblins and the trolls and the fairies and all of these mythological creatures. You're familiar with the particular design aesthetic and the particular type of theme that they designed these creatures on, in collaboration, of course, with the master puppet creator, Jim Henson. Really set a genre and really created a style that has been unparalleled since. You can't imitate that particular level of brilliance for certain specific reasons that I want to talk about today. Alan Lee, on the other hand, you might recognize. If it's not familiar, you will be familiar with him when you realize that he was one of the key concept artists for this movie, which will be getting to this series in the near future, so stay tuned for that. But he's one of the original Tolkien artists. Him and John Howe, Alan Lee and John Howe, were two of the principal concept artists, the lead concept artists for the films with Peter Jackson, with Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. They worked on both of them, and were two of the original and probably one of the most respected Tolkien artists that actually illustrated Tolkien's books. You bring these two masters together to create this book, and a lot of things can be learned. But there's one takeaway from these books in particular that I feel that once you start to dig into their minds and start to understand how they created and what they created, and the means at which they achieved their goals artistically, will unlock that artist block in you. I adhere to these books, I adhere to these lessons as an artist whenever I feel like I'm at a loss for what to do next. So let's crack it open. And you're gonna immediately start to recognize the unique style differences between these two different artists. If you're trying to identify with Brian Froud's work, think about Labyrinth. Think about Dark Crystal. If you want to think of Alan Lee's work, think about Lord of the Rings. And you're going to start to see that style and feeling behind their work. Now, I mentioned before that Brian Froud had influenced me profoundly as a young artist, or to-be artist one day. I was probably around my son's age, around 6 or 7. He created a book that had a lifelong impact on me and continues to impact me today at 44 years old as it did when I was 6 years old. It was his book called Brian Froud's Book of Pressed Fairies. If you haven't seen that book, it's one of the most brilliant illustrated books of all time. Essentially, the book was an illustrated book made to look like Brian Froud had caught pretty little fairies and squished them in a book, like you would with flowers, which, if you think about it, is kind of a dark theme, isn't it? That's not exactly an innocent thing. It's not exactly a child-friendly thing you would do to a pretty fairy. But as a child, reflecting back on my youth, looking at this book, I wasn't horrified by it. I wasn't disgusted by it. I was fascinated and entertained by it because I understood that it was an illustration. I had enough maturity at 5, 6 years old to know that it's a drawing I'm looking at and it's a cute idea. Besides, all of the fairies inside had silly little expressions on their face, like making fun of you. It's almost as if he caught them in the act of being mischievous, which is really cute, right? And his art and this theme stuck with me. It was a seed that was planted in my head moving forward. Now, when you look at over here, you can see Brian Froud's work. It immediately starts to become familiar to you if you've seen the movie Labyrinth. Like, for instance, when you look up close, if we look, maybe we can zoom in a little bit so you can see some of the details here. As you start to move through this page, you can see there's all these little hidden creatures in the shadows, big and small. with probably his wife, right? He did dote on her quite a bit. There you go. Who's also a very talented artist. And what you start to see, what you start to learn, and what you start to feel looking at this work is, although this was, at least on the surface, directed towards children, as was Lord of the Rings, by the way, with Mordor and the orcs and the dwarves and all that. These are children's books. But they were children's books written in a little bit more trusting a time, when there weren't an abundance of people out there crossing the lines of morality with kids with regards to marketing or YouTube videos or whatever the case might be, that ends up very often making parents, myself included, very concerned for your children's safety, what they're watching, the content they're exposed to. Back during the time of Brian Froud and Alan Lee, and Tolkien for that matter, they were allowed to be a little dark. They were allowed to be a little bit naughty and mischievous. There's nudity in this, but it's not gratuitous nudity, it's artistic nudity. She's a fairy creature, she doesn't wear clothes, and it's perfectly acceptable to see her like that, and I have absolutely zero qualms showing my kids this stuff. Little nude creatures is perfectly safe, but this is acceptable, and it's also very fascinating, and it's also very beautiful and very creative. All these little mushroom creatures, little baby, most likely, whenever you see something that looks very realistic, it's most likely from somebody he knows, right? Then you get into Alan Lee's work, and look at how delicate his line starts to get. Just a little bit of a side note, if you've ever watched the making of Lord of the Rings, the behind the scenes extended DVDs, which by the way, are the greatest art fuel you will ever get, ever. And I'm not just talking about the illustration side of it, I'm talking about the armor design, the costume design, the casting, the set location design, the lighting, the bigatures. I watched that series every night. It was my lullaby to bed. I would just play all on my DVD player, and I would fall asleep every night watching that. Same thing with The Hobbit. Alan Lee had a very unique way of drawing. John Howe, the other Tolkien artist, who I absolutely adore as well, he was explaining the differences in the way that he and Alan Lee would draw. John Howe was arguably a little bit faster than Alan Lee, but had a very different technique. He was more of a structural artist. He always had to kind of block in the sketch. He was much more methodical, and he'd kind of plan out his page in a very methodical way. His desk was a reflection of that, being very tidy and organized. Alan Lee, on the other hand, was more of a straight ahead, more starting at one point and moving your way across the page, just kind of discovering what he would draw as he moved his way across the page from one side to the other. And I could compare this directly, if you're familiar with animation, to key animation or pose-to-pose animation versus straight-ahead animation. Pose-to-pose key animation is what you typically see nowadays. It was for Disney films or things like that, where they draw the key, they structure things first, and then they fill in the gaps with breakdowns and in-betweens to make fluid animation. Whereas in straight-ahead animation, like Don Bluth is a very good example. Arguably, though, he did a lot of rotoscoping in his stuff. But a straight-ahead animator would be somebody who starts on frame 1 and then draws frame 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in sequence. And what it does is it might not have that same timed solidity, but it had a lot more spontaneity. There were more surprises. So if you've ever studied animation, Richard Williams, the guy who wrote the Animator Survival Kit, kind of like the Bible for animators, advocates for both, drawing straight ahead and pose to pose. And he teaches a technique on how you can do both. Now you translate that into art. As a teacher, one of the things that irritates me is this kind of like, paint by numbers type of approach to teaching and to being an artist. And what Alan Lee and John Howe had the liberty to discover on their own was that they had two different ways of approaching creativity. There was a way of actually holding the pencil and creating. There was a way of thinking. There was a way of starting and executing and finishing a piece that was unique between the two. And that's what allowed them to be able to create their greatest art. And to you, I extend that permission to you as an artist to allow yourself to experiment with different types of drawing. For instance, if you've seen my last video, my last art talk, where I was doing kind of that skeletal creature with the colorful veil and stuff like that, you'll notice that that's very straight ahead. A lot of people commented on the line how I just kind of put my pen down and I didn't even take my pen off the page. I just continued to draw with one continuous line. That's a very Alan Lee way of drawing. And I find that drawing that way allows me to unlock my spontaneity. As we start to delve through this, you start to realize that this isn't only a book of illustration. This is a compendium of creatures. Their understanding of the lore, of the backstory of these different creatures, and they describe them and they give backstories to all of them as we move forward. Here's just an introduction of their particular style. Then they start to discuss fairy rings. Let's flip through and continue to look at some examples, and then you get to a page like this where he has spriggans. You start to realize that we're dealing with full-grown adults, mature adults, trained, skilled artists that have dedicated their lives to delving into this deep mythological lore of these different specific creatures. The miser on the fairy gump, fairies on the eastern green. These are elaborate, these are artists that are dedicating their lives to studying mythological creatures. They're not just drawing fairies, they're drawing where fairies live and the uniquenesses between their different types of personality and the different species, the different races of fairies and different creatures. I'm just going to flip through very quickly. You can immediately tell if you're looking at an Alan Lee or a Brian Froud illustration. Some different humanoid or elven legends. Just going to let you enjoy this for a minute. Notice that for every single page he's illustrated, there's at least a little paragraph to describe what it is that he's drawn. The same thing applies to John Howe. He's not somebody who just draws armor. He's somebody who studies it, who LARPs a lot, and who owns many coats of armor. He's a particularly skinny guy, so he can fit into armor quite easily. It's beautiful frescoes, murals type illustrations, beautiful penmanship. Look at that beautiful handwriting. Hurling. Now we're getting to different races, different creatures. Fairy ways. Now he's starting to describe, or they're starting to describe, fairies in particular. And we start to delve deeper into the lore of fairies. Protection against fairies. Denizens of fairy. I'm just going to let the artwork speak for itself. Leprechauns. Now, leprechauns. We know leprechauns as Lucky Charms, as just some little creature at the end of the rainbow. No, to Alan Lee and John Howe, leprechauns play a very specific role. They have a place in mythology and have a very specific role to play in it in comparison to all these different creatures. Why am I emphasizing this? Why am I putting so much attention on this? It's all these goblins, definitely Labyrinth. You can even remember that shot where at the beginning of the movie when Sarah is contemplating having the Goblin King take Toby away from her. And she goes, Goblin King, Goblin King. She's saying this chant and they're saying, oh, she's gonna say the words. And they're all hiding in the mirror or something like that. They're hiding in the darkness. That's this. Jim Henson decided to make one of Brian Froud's type of like little murals of faces and creatures. The witch line, I guess, kobolds. A lot of these mythological creatures kobolds, you probably recognize them from World of Warcraft. It all starts, these are the guys that started all this stuff. Kobli now, dwarves. Again, not just any type of dwarf, there's many different species of dwarves. There's different clans of dwarves. All of this stuff translated into Tolkien's work. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Why do I keep describing this? It's because one of the main reasons why we get artist block is because we're thinking and creating too superficially. You want to draw an elf, so you think elven ears and an elven nose and blonde long hair and a bow and some green Peter Pan looking outfit. And then you sit down to draw that. And very often you blame your lack of skill as being the reason why your drawing is not successful. And more often than not, it's not your lack of skill, it's your lack of inspiration and your lack of depth. You didn't actually think of who this elf is and where they're from. Think about Tolkien's work. There's a very big difference between the Rivendell elves and the Lothlorien elves. The high elves versus the regular elves versus the dark elves. And then when you get into The Hobbit, you're introduced to yet another race of elf. Every different species has this very important backstory. When I start to do a drawing, there's one of two things that I do to spark an idea. Number one, I don't grab my paintbrush, I grab my pen and I write out a short story. I try to delve into what it is that I'm drawing and who they are and where they're from and what they're about, because that informs the costume, the haircut, the facial structure, the anatomy, the skin color, the posture, the personality, and I juxtapose that next to different creatures. The second thing I'll do is I'll look towards already pre-existing lore. Mavka, Kuchisake Onna, Hanako-san, La Llorona, okay? All of these different characters are based off of mythological lore from Japan, from Mexico, from US, from Germany, etc. These are very well-known myths. So what does that mean for me as an artist? That means that I'm illustrating something that has already been explored narratively for quite some time. There's a lot of back history to it, and that's what informs my painting. And understand, you are completely allowed to steal that idea and illustrate it. You're not claiming to have created La Llorona. What you're doing is you're creating your own artistic rendition, your own interpretation of that particular story. And you can give that same story to 150 different artists, the same story, the same lore, and you give it to 150 different people, and they will all draw something completely unique. None of them will be a forgery of the one next to them, because everybody thinks and creates differently. That's why we're so awesome. That's why we're artists. It's because we have that ability to create. So the takeaway that I want you to get from this book, and the lesson I want you to get from this is, number one, it's not just about drawing versus not drawing. There are a million different ways to draw. How you hold a pencil, how you start and finish a line, how you capture form, how you capture texture. Are you somebody who likes to draw more with line, or are you somebody who likes to draw more with form? Are you somebody who likes to start on a white page and paint contours and shadows, or somebody who prefers to start on a dark screen and paint with light? And furthermore, thinking superficially will generally create superficial art. The more you research, the more you delve deep into the backstory, either pre-created or something you create yourself, will unlock you, because it'll stimulate, it'll literally turn your visual mind off. And the cool thing about writing is that you can create an entire painting in 5 minutes, because it takes only a moment to write out an idea. But when you jump straight into an illustration, you're not giving yourself a chance to visualize. Bobby Chiu, one of my personal favorite artists, has always, for years, ever since I've known him, always advocated for visualizing. Close your eyes, think, imagine, place your character in a place, have them act, have them react to other people, have them behave in a certain way, dress them, give them a home, try to think of where they are. Gandalf loves the hobbits and loves hanging out with the hobbits and loves simple things, and he's more of a nomad who travels around. Radagast lives among the animals, who's fashioned a tree, and just by slapping wood to a tree, like a nest of a bird. Understanding their backstory and understanding their purpose fuels your design. And I guarantee you, if you take that approach and give some more time and thought into the story of what you're creating, you will unlock your greatest artwork, and you will give everything that you create purpose. And once you've unlocked that, the theme, the story that you want to work with, such as mythological creatures and lore from around the world, urban legends, or your own story that you've created, like Tyler Edlin's Sunderfall, like Noah Bradley's Son of Man, like Marco Bucci's creature, the boy in the green ball that he loves to illustrate all the time. They've gotten to know these creations intimately. I'm going to close on this. Chuck Jones was asked the question, being the director of Looney Tunes, he was asked the question, where the hell do you come up with all of those great ideas for your shows? And he said, I don't write anything. I don't tell my characters what to do ever. I know Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Porky Pig. I know them so well that all I have to do is just present them an obstacle. Here's the obstacle. And they do all the acting for him. He developed and knew those characters so intimately that the art made itself at a certain point, because they became real to him, as do all of these beautiful creatures to Alan Lee and Brian Froud. The fact that I delve into darker, grittier subjects is not because I'm into creepypasta. Not at all. It's because there's a certain beauty and elegance and richness of thought and expression that comes with not being safe all the time. But I understand the fact that being a little bit naughty and being a little bit mischievous is fun. And I think that's a lesson that everybody needs to learn from these artists. And hopefully this continues to be explored and appreciated and created moving forward artistically, like films like Matilda, for instance, which is one of the greatest children's films I've ever seen in my life. So thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was informative and inspiring as it is for me, and happy painting. Take care.